Thanks everybody for joining this Access webinar today. I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing and hosting Professor Stuart Barr, who I'll introduce formally in a moment. But no, thanks for joining. Stuart, if you could just forward the slide for me, please. Thanks. So as is kind of normal business for our Access webinars, we really like to encourage interaction with the audience as much as possible between the audience and our speaker. So the presentation today will be around 25 minutes or so, and then there's plenty of time afterwards for Q&A. You'll notice your microphones and cameras are off, so do post your questions into the chat, into the Q&A, and then I'll obviously put your questions to Stuart as we get towards the end. The session is recorded and then afterwards will be hosted on the Access webinar. And then Stuart, if you could just move on to the next slide for me, please. Thank you very much. And so very quickly, just to say a bit of background about Access for anyone who isn't already familiar with the project. Access stands for Advancing Capacity for Climate and Environmental Social Science. We are a 5-year project. We're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and we are co-led from the universities of Exeter and the University of Surrey. And we've got lots of partners across other universities, public sector, charities, and so on. And what we do as a project, we get involved in all kinds of different activities to basically champion the environmental social sciences, how the social sciences can help contribute to challenges such as biodiversity loss, net zero, decarbonisation, and so on. And by environmental social science, we really mean the systematic study of the interrelations between 3 kind of core dynamic areas. So people, the social environments that we live, work and inhabit in, and then also the natural environment. So all of the rest of the world around us, including the living and the non-living aspects. And so without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to our presenter today, Professor Stuart Barr. Stuart's a Professor of Geography at the University of Exeter, and he is a co-investigator on the Access programme. He works as part of the guiding principles with myself, Kate Birmingham, Steve Gilbert and Sarah Hartley, and his research focuses on engaging publics with environmental issues and developing ways to promote behavioural change in personal consumption with a particular emphasis on transport and mobility. So without anything further, I shall hand over to Stuart.
Right, thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining this afternoon. As you can see, the topic I want to cover today is focused on travel, which, as Sarah said, is a research area of mine. And I want to focus in particular on thinking about how we can reduce the carbon impact of our travel footprint in the workplace. And this has been inspired by the work that I've been doing with Sarah and colleagues through the Access Guiding Principles, which I'll say something about later on in the presentation. And it also relates to work that I've been doing here at the University of Exeter with our sustainability team and academic colleagues in the geography department where I'm based, to try and reduce the impact of our research and education related activities. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk you through 3 case studies, 2 from the University of Exeter and 1 from the Access programme, which give you some insights into the ways that we've been approaching these issues. I think the way that I've phrased the title, the word can is very important, because I think there are mechanisms that are available, and I think that there are a lot of things that we can do. But this area, as we found out within the Access Guiding Principles team, is very complex indeed. And there are unlikely to be any kind of quick rules that one can immediately implement. Actually, dealing with this issue requires a great deal of thought, of sensitivity. It requires a lot of co-production. And it requires you to be very flexible. So I would say that when we're thinking about decarbonising travel in the workplace, we're very much talking about a process that we need to undertake with our colleagues, rather than just quickly implementing rules that affect everybody. And I'll talk about why that's the case a bit later on. So in terms of what I want to cover in the presentation today, because I work in a university, I'm going to talk about the workplace within the context of higher education, so universities. And if you're not from a university, I still hope that you will gain a lot through perhaps understanding the complexities that you might have in your own organisation, the tensions that may emerge around this issue for your own organisation. So I think even though I'll be talking about HE, actually there are a lot of things that we can learn that have implications for most workplaces, particularly large organisations. I'll then say a little bit about the academic research that's been undertaken on academic travel, because there's been a lot of focus on this, particularly as academics are the people who are doing a lot of climate research. So there's been a lot of commentary on what academics are doing to reduce their own carbon footprints. I'll then set that into context with the Axis guiding principles. And today I'm going to be focusing on environmental sustainability, but I will, of course, be connecting that to in equality, diversity and inclusion, and also knowledge co-production, because the Axis guiding principles are designed to work with all three together. They're designed to be integrated. And then I'm going to give you three case studies, three stories of change, two from the University of Exeter and the final one from the Access programme, about how we've been trying to change what we do and promote that within the wider social science community. The final part of the presentation, and we will make these slides available separately from the recording, has some reflections I've got on ways that we can think about change within an academic context. I haven't got time to go through those today, and they are self-explanatory, so those will also be available. All of the references that I have for today and the resources will all be linked from that presentation online. And on the right-hand side, I've just got 4 outputs from my own research and writing in this area that may well be of use. The top right one is more of a popular science article about flying and climate change. The one on the bottom right was published on Tuesday in the journal Geo, and it was a collaboration from academics from across a range of geography departments in the UK, looking at how we can think about the future of fieldwork in geography within the context of environmental sustainability and equality, diversity and inclusion, EDI. And that's very much focused on trying to reduce the carbon impact of the way we travel for our fieldwork in geography, but also trying to do that in a way that makes fieldwork more accessible and inclusive. So let's take a look at travel and higher education. I've got some images that will be familiar to anyone who works in any university, certainly in the UK. Universities very much now have a global reach in terms of their activities. And so most universities will have internationalization agendas. It's called Global Exeter, where I work. Our students are encouraged to study abroad in the third of a 4-year undergraduate degree. We encourage students to come to Exeter from overseas, particularly from outside Europe, on international summer schools. And something that's really close to my heart, because as a geographer, I do a lot of field work with students. This quotation on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, this is actually from our Department of Ecology and Conservation at the University of Exeter, promoting the kind of exotic, exciting nature of travel for fieldwork. So travel is really embedded in most of the activities that universities undertake. And if you wanted a list of the kinds of travel activities that we're talking about, I've put 6 bullet points here on the screen. And again, for most organisations, there will be a travel footprint associated with daily commuting. There'll be a travel footprint associated with the activities of that organisation. So in the case of a university, it's travel for students to and from campuses at the beginning and the end of term, students going on exchanges and study abroad, people like Sarah and I and the other researchers on Access going to conferences, workshops, meetings and field work. Travel for recruitment and reputational enhancement, which is often undertaken by senior management in an organisation. And again, student field courses, very specific to the university, of course. The challenge we find, and it may be the same in your organisation if you don't work in a university, is that these, what we call scope 3 emissions, carbon emissions, are actually very difficult to calculate for large organisations. Because in an organisation like a university, well, some travel is very much an individual entity. So students will travel to and from their home country, for example, and we won't have a record of that. They don't book it through our system, so we don't have some data related to that very easily. Some travel for staff at the university will be booked through our travel management company, but some of it won't be. So again, there's a little bit of data leakage there and uncertainty. Some travel will be booked by third-party providers. And also the final one, which I think is really interesting, is that the carbon impact of, say, rail travel, we know it is lower than flying, quite significantly lower, but we find it more difficult to calculate because air travel generally happens almost in a straight line, point to point. So the data that we have on the impact of travel organisationally can actually be very complicated, and it's probably the same for other organisations as well. Just to give you an idea on this slide of what we are talking about, I've looked here at two outputs, one from the University of Exeter and an academic paper based on research at the University of Montreal. And what I wanted to highlight here was firstly, the carbon impact from emissions associated with travel in a university is very significant. And it's particularly significant when we think about the amount of long haul travel that happens for business travel. And in particular, for more senior managers, the carbon impact of business class flights. So the headline for the University of Exeter white paper on the climate and environment emergency, which is in the public domain from 2019, is that actually this is a very significant part of our carbon emissions. And then I think the figures from the University of Montreal published in a paper back in 2019 are fascinating because it also highlights that these emissions are not equally distributed amongst staff and students. But as you can see there, actually professors, very senior academic staff, have a much larger travel footprint than either students or more early career or junior colleagues. So headlines really from this slide is that travel is a very significant contributor to the carbon emissions of higher education institutions. And secondly, that there are quite a lot of inequalities there. Quite a lot of the emissions are concentrated in a relatively small number of people. Now, these issues have been covered quite extensively in academic writing on academic travel. And the GEO review that I pointed out that was published on Tuesday, led by my colleague here in geography, Ewan Woodley, is quite a good read because it explores some of these issues associated with decarbonisation and its relationship with equality, diversity and inclusion within the context of fieldwork. And so that's quite an up-to-date review that has lots of useful references that you might find interesting. But what I've tried to cover on this slide is some of the key issues that emerge from academic writing, which is really asking the question, why do we travel so much as academics? And why is it so difficult to try and reduce our travel footprint and decarbonise our travel? So we know that academics have talked about the urgent need for change. But the challenge, as I've already said, about the fact that the business model of most universities and many organisations is based on a hypermobile environment. And so many of the activities that we undertake as universities, such as global engagement, recruitment, student field trips, business travel, they are very carbon intensive. There's quite a lot of writing that suggests that this is pretty embedded in the academic career trajectory. So status and identity formation are seen as very much wrapped up with having a kind of hypermobile, aeromobile lifestyle in terms of your kind of professional outlook. And that is seen to impact your career development. So putting it in crude terms, if you're prevented from going to these signature international academic conferences, that is regarded as affecting negatively your career development. So that's a big concern that many people have in terms of academic research. There are also more practical concerns associated with the value of time, associated with perhaps travelling by train or coach or ferry, because it does usually take longer than flying. And there are also concerns in the literature that have been highlighted around the cost of no-fly travel. It's also the case that academic researchers feel quite overwhelmed and disempowered. They don't feel that they can break out of these business models and these constraints that are around them, and it's quite difficult to gain agency to change one's behaviour. And crucially, a theme that I will pick up on later on through the case studies, there's a real significance, as we found in the Access programme, associated with connecting attempts to decarbonise travel with issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. Because it's very much the case that coming up with crude, quick rules can often be discriminatory and can exclude people from measures that are trying to reduce the carbon impact of travel. So thinking about those issues together is really significant. And that's what we've been trying to do with the Access guiding principles. I think Sarah's going to put a link to the guiding principles in the chat, and there's also a QR code here if you're interested in following that too. These guiding principles were developed a couple of years ago, as Sarah said, by a team who were working on environmental sustainability, which is the focus of this slide, equality, diversity and inclusion, and knowledge co-production. And I'm focusing today on environmental sustainability because the talk is about decarbonising travel in the workplace. So not surprisingly, the environmental sustainability principles are about minimising environmental impact. They're trying to spread the benefits of changing what we do and spreading those across different constituencies that we might be working with. And I think the third bullet point is something I feel really strongly about, which is that we want to make acting in an environmentally sustainable way a positive identifiable element of the professional conduct of environmental social science researchers. But crucially, these last two bullet points, we need to be cognizant of and work with EDI to ensure that what we're trying to do on decarbonisation is done in an equitable way and an inclusive way. And then the final point, that we're doing that in a co-productive way rather than simply a small group of people coming up with rules and then implementing them. So I'll move on for the last 10 to 15 minutes to have a look at these case studies that I said I wanted to talk you through. So I've been involved at the University of Exeter in two initiatives that I'm going to talk through, one to do with fieldwork, travel for undergraduate students, and the second one related to enabling rail travel across the university as a response to the environment and climate emergency. And then the third case study will be to talk you through finally what we've been doing in the Access programme on trying to reduce our travel footprint through developing a bespoke travel policy. So on this first one, this is really all about an undergraduate geography field course that we developed a couple of years ago now to try and begin reducing the impact of our department's carbon footprint associated with fieldwork. Before COVID, our department ran 3 field courses outside of Europe, obviously by air. We removed those during COVID and we've never replaced them since. So we're in a better position than we were. We now have about 4 field courses for undergraduate students. From March next year, 2 of the 4 will be no-fly field courses to the Black Forest and to southern France. And we hope by 2026 that all our field courses will be fly-free courses. What I'm going to talk to you about briefly today was really an experiment, and I really emphasize the word experiment because we saw an opportunity to try and respond in our department to the environment climate emergency, and we knew that we couldn't just come up with a new field course within months. So we thought, what could we do? And the staff going on our Bay of Naples field course, which is a week-long field course at the end of it was the end of March 2023. We said, let's try that by train. And very generously, our head of department said, OK, go for it. Let's see what happens. I will tell you now, I think we bit off far more than we could chew because it is a very long way to go by train. But we did it. And I will say now that despite the booking process being very, very challenging indeed, and I'll talk about that in a minute, the actual trip itself did literally run like clockwork. Every train was on time, which was quite astonishing, actually, given the complexity of it. So this was our first attempt in the geography department at the campus I work on to take a field course by train internationally. And you can see on the itinerary there, effectively you have 2 days travel out, 2 days travel back, and you have 5 days field work based in Sorrento in the Bay of Naples. Quite a lot of students. I wouldn't recommend taking that number of students that distance again. And we booked it via our university travel management company, which is something we've changed since then. So what were the issues that we encountered? Well, I've divided this into pre and post trip, and I've got a few photos on this and the next slide which show you some happy students. I think they were generally happy, if rather fatigued. That was when we arrived back at St Pancras after the trip. Okay, what were the issues we encountered before the trip? The first one, which may be familiar to lots of you if you have tried to book rail travel as an alternative to air travel for a business trip, is that travel management companies, these large companies that support travel within businesses and large organizations, are generally not set up to deal very well with groups, and certainly not to deal with groups who want to not fly. So I think the first thing to say is that the support that you might get from a large travel management company could be quite limited depending on how far down the road they are on the kind of decarbonisation journey. Booking rail itineraries is very complex in Europe because there are territorially based rail companies. They each have their own timetables, their own pricing structures. They release them at different times of the year with different lead-in times to when you can book, and they have different capacities. And of course, within an institution like a university or a business, there is limited knowledge about how to do this more innovative way of traveling. So we're kind of learning from the very beginning here. Student expectations before the trip were really interested. We measured these using surveys before we actually went on the trip. And it was interesting that we picked up a very familiar refrain from people about rail travel as an alternative to air travel, which is this was considered as dead time. It wasn't useful time. There were lots of anxieties about how trains worked because many of our students don't use the train, and they certainly haven't used the train in Europe. So there was a great deal of novelty associated with that anxiety. And then just anxieties about the practicalities, comfort, seating, subsistence, costs, carrying luggage, all things which people felt very competent with air travel because they were used to it, they'd been brought up with it, but actually international train travel was very different. From my perspective as the trip leader, I spent a lot of sleepless nights worrying about whether our insurance cover would help us if we were stuck somewhere because a train was cancelled or delayed or something like that happened. I was kind of quite familiar with what happened with air travel and compensation, but I was much less familiar with what would happen with the rail travel overseas. And therefore, what would happen on the trip? Who would support me and my colleagues if something happened and we needed help? And so then that also, those pre-trip issues were picked up with staff resource, because actually planning a trip like this required a lot more input from me than I would be associated with just going to the travel management company and saying, could you book me 44 seats on this flight to Naples, please? And then in terms of issues that we encountered on the trip, well, there are a couple of positive bullet points here to start us off. Amazingly good positive experiences of place, bearing in mind our students are geographers, so they're very interested in place. We all felt we'd been on a journey. We genuinely travelled. We had travelled from Exeter St David's all the way down to Sorrento by train, which is a remarkable experience. And there were certain moments of wonder when you pop out of a tunnel and you're in a totally different landscape. You know, we left Switzerland on day 2 in the drab and the grey and the wet. 10 minutes later, we pop out into the Italian side of the Alps and it's hot sunshine. That was just an amazing experience. And I think from a kind of academic point of view, it was definitely the case that the group coherence was a lot better because students are literally socializing on the train in a way that you don't do at an airport and an aeroplane. You are sitting in seats facing each other. You can play cards, you can play other board games, you can go to the buffet, you can do crosswords, whatever it is. It's a lot more of a sociable experience. But we did begin to learn a lot also about accessibility, and this relates to the work we're doing in Access on EDI. So certainly students were much more fatigued. That's not surprising, but certainly students who did suffer chronic fatigue syndrome, we realised that they required a lot more support travelling by train than necessarily going on an aeroplane, which is a relatively short journey. There were issues associated with dietary needs and anxieties around where it might be possible to pick up things like gluten-free or lactose-free snacks, which are probably better catered for in international airports than they might be in local railway stations. Some students, again, the ones with chronic fatigue syndrome, highlighted the demands of always having your luggage with you. You don't pop it into a check-in counter on a conveyor belt and it's gone for 3 or 4 hours. You actually have to carry this. You have to put it up onto the luggage rack. And that was a different experience for people. And generally, just the emotional demand of travelling longer days was something that we picked up, which we then responded to in the way that we adjusted this trip. There were some very interesting comments about perceptions of discomfort and time. So several students commented that they thought rail travel was more uncomfortable than air travel. But what I think they're getting at there is perhaps not the physical comfort of the seat, which by definition would have had more leg room. It was more that the experience itself was discomforting. It was unfamiliar. I think that's what they were probably getting at. And the final thing is, I will say I never want to take a group of 44 students on the Paris Metro ever again, because herding that number of people around in quite a chaotic environment is very difficult. So on this slide, I will now tell you what we've done in order to try and address quite a lot of those concerns. What we realised, as I said before, is that going that far with that number of students was something we couldn't do again. So we decided to plan a new field course, which was much more, I think, pedagogically tied to the themes that we wanted to talk about. So we've come up with an environmental futures field course, which is run to Freiburg in the Black Forest, southwest Germany. And as you can see on the left-hand side in the bullet points, we did the following things to try and make the trip more accessible and inclusive and easier to run. So we had a staff planning trip. We made sure that we could get to Freiburg from Exeter and back again in one day rather than having to stay overnight somewhere. So you're reducing the risks involved. You build in lots of time redundancy in case trains are late. You have better rest breaks. You reduce the travel risks perhaps by understanding exactly what your contingency plan will be if a train is cancelled or delayed. You are much more attentive to individual student needs. So we asked students to self-identify this time if they felt that they would need more support. And we had one-to-one meetings, several one-to-one meetings with some students to be able to talk them through and support them through the process. And the final thing we did was we booked the trip as an interim measure independently, because we felt that would be easier for us to have control over all the moving parts. We've now moved to a new travel company who specialise in rail travel for students. So that's been really great. So my second example in the last 5 minutes relates to another piece of work I'm involved with at the University of Exeter, which is part of our environment and climate emergency work, working with the sustainability team at the University of Exeter. And about a year ago, a group of colleagues came to me and the director of sustainability at the university, and they said, we really want to promote rail travel. We've got this new travel policy, which has this travel hierarchy that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here. Viably, rail travel is going to be the alternative that most people think of if they're not going to be flying, certainly for UK and near continent European travel. But we know that rail travel can be really difficult, and we think it would be a good idea to do a deep dive to try and understand exactly how we could promote rail travel and what the challenges are. So I set up a task and finish group, as it's called here at Exeter University, and we had about 20 people on the group, academics and professional services staff. We had 5 working groups. So one working group was on, for example, was on accessibility and inclusion. Another was on procurement and booking support, and so on. And we wrote quite an extensive report, and I'm just going to share 2 slides. The first slide just identifies the challenges that report identifies. And our kind of evidence base was a survey of 320 academic and professional services staff, as well as lots of intelligence that the subgroups of the committee were picking up, and other kind of experiences from academic staff who'd already used trains for business travel. I don't think I won't read through all of these because there isn't time here. And I think all of these will make sense to most of you because these are the kinds of things that probably if you've had these conversations, you are hearing a lot. You know, for example, the one that's really meaningful me is the fact that we do have a cultural preference for flying. And that is something that needs to be dealt with kind of from the top to the bottom of the organisation. The other one that my colleague Rachel Griffiths at the University of Exeter worked on very intensively with a subgroup was on accessibility, equality, diversity and inclusion. Because many of the barriers that we know exist associated with lower carbon travel are associated with a range of physical needs, mental health needs. We did quite a lot of work on neurodiversity and rail travel, and obviously then thinking about the different circumstances that staff have in relation to caring responsibilities, for example, and the issues associated with that. Then the other thing I'd highlight from this slide is about incentives. People felt that the incentives to use train travel just didn't exist. Actually, the incentives were to do things cheaply, to do things quickly, to do things conveniently. And actually, the rail systems themselves, the booking systems, the lack of support, the lack of consideration for EDI meant that actually they weren't being given an incentive to travel by train. So very quickly, some recommendation themes. Again, I won't talk through these in detail because I think they should make sense to people on the call today. But really, we identified a really broad range of issues that we needed to pick up. And each of these were associated with very specific recommendations for different groups and individuals in the university to deal with to try and promote rail travel. So certainly EDI related support was absolutely crucial for us, as well as changing those incentives and also building in to the finance of the university a recognition that sometimes travelling in a lower carbon way is going to cost more, and you have to build that into all of your internal grants and the costing of external grant applications and so on. So I'm going to finish on this slide, and this is just to tell you what we've been doing in the Access programme in relation to travel. So Sarah, who introduced me, has been working very intensively on this, as well as I have. And there's some resources that you'll be able to click on there on the Access website, which I expect Sarah will also put into the chat today. Effectively, what we found in Access in relation to our guiding principles was that people wanted more detail about how they actually should make decisions in relation to travel. Because what we were finding was that there were actually some key tensions that were emerging that connected an attempt to be more environmentally conscious in your travel and individual concerns related to EDI. And those might have been related to time, for example, caring responsibilities. They might have been concerns related to cost. They might have been concerns related to mental or physical health. And so what we've done is been through a structured process in the Access network of working through actually what should our travel policy really be. And where we landed on this, which I think is quite interesting, is that we still, as is the essence of the guiding principles, feel that this is something that is for the individual to decide for themselves based on their understanding of what we're trying to achieve in Access. But what we have done is to say, actually, we do have a preference for no-fly travel, but we express it as a preference because we understand that there will be individual circumstances that mean that people cannot always follow through with that preference. And secondly, there can be occasions where in-person attendance at an event is actually really valuable and outweighs the environmental considerations. So there's lots that you can read about in terms of our decision making there. I've written a blog on the Access website. It's either there now or shortly will be there, a really fascinating blog that Sarah has led, which is a kind of discussion piece about decision making for travelling to a conference in Barcelona over the summer. I'm going to finish there, so we have time for some questions. Thank you for listening, and I will stop sharing my slides. Thanks.